The old violin case felt heavier than usual in his hands. Not because of its weight, but because of what this moment meant. Cale had carried this case through rain and snow, through bus stations and subway cars, through 7 long years of waiting. And now, standing in the marble hallway of the Vienna Grand Conservatory, he felt like that same nervous kid who had first touched a violin in his grandfather's dusty workshop. He was 32 years old. In the world of classical music, that made him ancient. Most of the people auditioning today were in their early 20s. Some, even younger. They had trained at the finest schools since childhood. They had parents who could afford private lessons and summer programs in Europe. They had connections and recommendations and fancy degrees hanging on their walls. Cale had none of that. What he had was a violin that was older than his grandmother, a suit he had bought from a thrift store for $12, and a dream that refused to die no matter how many times life tried to kill it. He looked around the waiting area. Young musicians sat in expensive clothes, their instruments gleaming under the soft lights. Some were practicing quietly, their fingers moving with the confidence of people who had never doubted their place in the world. Others chatted with their parents or coaches, discussing strategy like this was a chess match they had already won. No one looked at Cale. Or maybe they did, but they looked through him, as if he were invisible. He was used to that feeling. He had been invisible his whole life. Growing up in a small apartment above his mother's laundromat in Detroit, Cale had discovered music by accident. He was 8 years old when his grandfather passed away, leaving behind nothing but a few old photographs and a violin that nobody wanted. His mother had planned to sell it, but something made Cale ask if he could keep it. She had looked at him with tired eyes and said yes, probably thinking he would lose interest in a week. He never did. There was no money for lessons. There was barely money for food. So Cale taught himself. He watched videos on the old computer at the public library. He borrowed books that were falling apart and studied them until the pages were burned into his memory. He practiced in the back room of the laundromat, surrounded by the sound of washing machines and dryers, playing the same pieces over and over until his fingers bled and his mother had to bandage them. The other kids in his neighborhood thought he was strange. They played basketball and video games while he sat alone with his violin, chasing something he could not name. His teachers told him to focus on practical things, to get a real job, to stop dreaming. Even his mother, who loved him more than anything, sometimes looked at him with worry in her eyes, wondering if she should tell him the truth that the world did not make room for people like them. But Cale kept playing. Through high school, through the jobs at grocery stores and gas stations, through the nights when he was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. He played at small churches and community centers, at nursing homes where old people cried when they heard him, at street corners where strangers dropped coins into his open case. And slowly, something began to happen. People started to notice. They started to listen. They started to say that there was something different about the way this young man played, something that could not be taught in any school. 5 years ago, Cale had sent a recording to the Vienna Grand Conservatory. It was a long shot, the longest shot imaginable. The conservatory was one of the most prestigious music institutions in the world. They received thousands of applications every year from the best young musicians on the planet. The idea that they would even listen to a recording from a self-taught nobody in Detroit was laughable. But they did listen. And 3 months later, Cale received a letter that changed his life. They wanted him to audition, in person, in Vienna. It had taken him 5 years to save enough money for the trip. 5 years of working double shifts, of skipping meals, of sleeping in his car to save on rent. 5 years of holding on to that letter like it was a lifeline, reading it on the nights when he wanted to give up, reminding himself that someone, somewhere, had heard something in his music worth hearing. And now he was here, in Vienna, in the building where the greatest musicians in history had walked. And in less than an hour, He would play for a panel of judges who held his entire future in their hands. The door to the audition hall opened, and a young woman walked out. She was crying, but not from sadness. Her face was glowing with joy. Her parents rushed to hug her, and Kale heard them say that she had done wonderfully, that the judges had loved her, that her future was secured. He looked away. He could not afford to think about failure. Not now. Not after everything. A staff member appeared with a clipboard. She was a thin woman with glasses and a formal smile that did not reach her eyes. She looked at Kale, then at his old violin case, then at his thrift store suit. Something flickered across her face. It might have been pity. It might have been doubt. It might have been both. "You are next," she said. "The panel is ready for you." Kyle stood up. His legs felt weak. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He thought about his grandfather, who had played this same violin in a refugee camp after the war, bringing music to people who had lost everything. He thought about his mother, who was probably sitting in the laundromat right now, waiting by the phone, praying for good news. He could not let them down. He could not let himself down. The hallway to the audition room felt endless. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor, each one bringing him closer to the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. He passed portraits of famous composers on the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow him, watching, judging, wondering if this young man from Detroit had any right to walk these halls. Finally, he reached the door. It was large and wooden, carved with designs that probably cost more than everything Kale owned. Behind it sat the judges, who would decide his fate. Behind it sat his future, whatever that future might be. He took a deep breath, then another. His hand was shaking as he reached for the handle. In just a few moments, he would step onto that stage. He would face some of the most powerful people in the music world. And among them, sitting at the center of the panel, was a man whose name was spoken in whispers throughout the classical music community. Maestro Heinrich Vogel. A living legend. A genius. And according to everyone who knew him, the cruelest judge in the history of the conservatory. People said that Vogel had made grown men cry with a single word. They said he had ended careers before they even began. They said he could spot a fraud from across the room and took pleasure in exposing them in front of everyone. Kale had heard all the stories. He had tried not to believe them. But, standing here now, with his hand on the door, he felt a cold fear creeping into his chest. What if they were right? What if he did not belong here? What if everything he had worked for was about to crumble in front of his eyes? He closed his eyes and thought of his grandfather's words, spoken so many years ago that they felt like a dream. "The violin does not lie," the old man had said. "When the world refuses to listen, let the music speak." I made seek. Kale opened his eyes. He pushed open the door, and he stepped into the light. The audition room was larger than Kale had imagined. High ceilings stretched above him, decorated with paintings of angels and clouds that seemed to belong in a museum. Crystal chandeliers hung from golden chains, casting soft light across the polished wooden floor. The walls were lined with velvet curtains, the color of blood, and at the far end of the room, a grand piano sat silent like a sleeping giant. But Kale barely noticed any of this. His eyes were fixed on the long table at the center of the room, where 5 judges sat watching him, like predators watching prey. 4 of them looked bored. They had seen hundreds of auditions, maybe thousands, and their faces showed the tiredness of people who had stopped expecting to be surprised. They held papers and pens, ready to write notes that would determine whether Kale's dream lived or died. But it was the man in the middle who made Kale's blood run cold. Maestro Heinrich Vogel was 73 years old, but he looked like he could live forever out of pure stubbornness. His white hair was combed back perfectly, not a single strand out of place. His suit probably cost more than Kale made in a year. His fingers were long and thin, the fingers of a man who had conducted the greatest orchestras in the world for half a century. And his eyes. Those eyes were the coldest things Kael had ever seen. They were pale blue, like ice on a frozen lake, and they held no warmth, no kindness, no mercy. When Vogel looked at you, it felt like he was looking through you, seeing every weakness, every flaw, every reason you did not deserve to be in his presence. Right now, those eyes were fixed on Kael, and they did not like what they saw. Kael walked to the center of the stage, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. His throat was dry. His hands were sweating, but he had come too far to turn back now. He stopped at the mark on the floor where he was supposed to stand. He opened his violin case with trembling fingers and lifted out his grandfather's instrument. In this room full of wealth and perfection, the old violin looked out of place. Its wood was scratched and worn. Its strings had been replaced so many times that Kael had lost count. It was not beautiful by any standard measure, but to Kael, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. He lifted the violin to his shoulder. He raised his bow. He took a breath to begin, and that was when Maestro Vogel raised his hand. "Stop!" The word cut through the air like a knife. Kael froze, his bow hovering an inch above the strings. He had not played a single note. Noting man. Vogel leaned forward in his chair, his cold eyes narrowing. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at Kael, studying him the way a scientist might study an insect under a microscope. Then he spoke, and his voice was worse than his eyes. It was soft and calm, the voice of a man who knew he held all the power and enjoyed using it. "What is your name?" "Kael," he managed to say. "Kael Whitmore." Vogel nodded slowly, as if the name confirmed something he had already suspected. He turned to the other judges with a thin smile that held no humor. "Another one," he said. "Another dreamer who thinks he can walk in here and impress us with his tragic story." The other judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, looked like she wanted to say something, but did not dare. Vogel turned back to Kael. His smile was gone now, replaced by something colder. "Let me guess," he said. "You are self-taught. You learned from the internet and library books. You practiced in some basement or garage while your family struggled to pay the bills. You have no formal training, no proper education, no credentials of any kind. But you believe that your passion makes up for all of that. You believe that your suffering has given you something that cannot be taught." Each word hit Kael like a punch to the stomach, because every word was true. "Am I close?" Vogel asked, though it was not really a question. Kael did not know what to say. He stood there, frozen, feeling smaller with every second that passed. Vogel leaned back in his chair and sighed, the sigh of a man who had seen this scene play out 1,000 times before. "I have been judging auditions for 40 years, he said. 40 years of listening to young people who think they are special. Do you know what I have learned in all that time?" Kael shook his head. "I have learned that talent is not democratic," Vogel said. "It does not care about your dreams or your struggles or how hard you have worked. Talent is something you are born with, something that cannot be faked or forced. And I can spot it in 3 notes. Sometimes I can spot it before a single note is played. I can see it in the way a person holds their instrument, the way they stand, the way they breathe." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And when I look at you," he continued, "I see nothing. No talent. No potential. Nothing but a young man who has wasted years of his life chasing something he will never catch." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kael felt his face burning with shame. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel tears threatening to form in his eyes, but he refused to cry. "Not here, not in front of this man. You are talentless," Vogel said, and the words seemed to echo off the walls. "Completely and utterly talentless. And no amount of practice or passion, or suffering will change that. Some people are meant to make music. You are meant to listen to it. There is no shame in that. The shame is in refusing to accept the truth. One of the other judges cleared his throat. Heinrich, he said quietly, perhaps we should let him play something before we make a decision. Vogel waved his hand dismissively. Why? So we can waste another 5 minutes pretending there is something to evaluate? I have heard enough. I have seen enough. This audition is over. He looked at KL one final time, and there was something almost like pity in his cold eyes. But it was not kind pity. It was the pity of someone looking at a lost cause. Go home, Vogel said. Go back to wherever you came from, and find something useful to do with your life. Music is not for everyone. It is certainly not for you. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kale stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. 7 years. 7 years of working and saving and dreaming, and it had all come down to this. A man who had never heard him play a single note had just told him that his entire life had been a waste. The woman with gray hair looked at him with sympathy. The other judges avoided his eyes. Somewhere in the back of the room, a staff member was already moving toward the door, ready to escort him out. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with a performance, not with a fair chance, but with judgment passed before he could even try. Kael felt something breaking inside him. Not his heart, something deeper than that, something that had kept him going through all the hard years, all the lonely nights, all the moments when giving up would have been so much easier. He looked down at the violin in his hands. His grandfather's violin. The instrument that had survived wars and loss and decades of silence before finding its way to him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard his grandfather's voice, soft and steady, speaking words that had been his anchor for as long as he could remember. The violin does not lie. When the world refuses to listen, let the music speak. Kael looked up. His hands had stopped shaking. His eyes were dry, and for the first time since he had walked into this room, he was not afraid. The staff member was already walking toward him. She had that look on her face, the look of someone doing an unpleasant task they had done many times before. In a few seconds, she would reach him. She would politely but firmly guide him toward the door. And that would be the end of everything. Kale thought about all the people who had ever told him no. The teachers who said he was wasting his time. The neighbors who laughed at the sounds coming from the laundromat. The music store owner who refused to let him touch the expensive violins because he looked like he could not afford them. His whole life had been a series of closed doors and turned backs and voices, telling him that people like him did not get to have dreams like his. And now here was another voice. The most powerful voice of all, telling him the same thing everyone else had always told him. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the years of struggle finally reaching a breaking point. Maybe it was the memory of his grandfather's hands, guiding his own across the strings for the first time. Maybe it was simply that he had nothing left to lose. Whatever it was, it made him do something that surprised everyone in that room, including himself. He planted his feet on the floor and did not move. The staff member stopped, confused. She looked at Vogel, then back at Kale, uncertain what to do. This was not how these things usually went. When the maestro dismissed someone, they left. They always left. Some cried. Some begged. Some walked out with their heads held high, pretending they did not care. But they all left. Kale did not leave. With respect, Maestro, he said. And his voice came out steadier than he expected. You have not heard me play yet. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The other judges stared at Kale with wide eyes, as if he had just done something unthinkable. Which, in a way, he had. Vogel's expression did not change. But something flickered in those cold blue eyes. It might have been surprise. It might have been anger. It was hard to tell. "Excuse me?" he said softly. Cale swallowed hard. His heart was pounding again. But he forced himself to keep talking. "You said you can judge talent in 3 notes," he said. "But you have not given me the chance to play even one. You looked at my clothes and my violin and decided I was not worth your time. But that is not judging talent. That is judging appearance." A gasp came from somewhere in the room. The woman with gray hair covered her mouth with her hand. The other judges looked at each other with expressions that mixed shock with something that might have been admiration. Nobody talked to Heinrich Vogel like this. Nobody. Vogel stood up slowly from his chair. He was not a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to fill the entire room. His face was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to his voice when he spoke. "Young man," he said, "do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" "Yes," Cale said. "I am speaking to a man who has spent 40 years judging people before giving them a fair chance. I am speaking to a man who has probably destroyed dozens of careers with a wave of his hand. I am speaking to the most respected conductor in the world, and I am asking him to do something very simple." He paused, gathering his courage for what came next. "I am asking him to listen." The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Vogel stared at Cale, with an expression that was impossible to read. The staff member stood frozen halfway across the room, not knowing whether to continue or retreat. The other judges seemed to be holding their breath. Then Vogel did something unexpected. He laughed. It was not a warm laugh or a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just found something amusing in the most unexpected place. He shook his head slowly, and when he spoke again, there was a new tone in his voice. Not friendly, but different. Curious, perhaps. "You have courage," he said. "I will give you that. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless." He sat back down in his chair and folded his hands on the table in front of him. His eyes were still cold, but they were watching Cale more carefully now, as if seeing him for the first time. "Very well," Vogel said. "You want to play? Play. I will give you 3 minutes. Not a second more. And when those 3 minutes are over, when you have proven exactly what I already know, you will leave this room and never come back. Do you understand?" Cale nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. "Good," Vogel said. He made a small gesture with his hand, dismissing the staff member. She retreated to the back of the room, looking relieved to be out of the middle of whatever was happening. Cale was alone on the stage now. Just him and his grandfather's violin, and 3 minutes to change his life. He lifted the instrument to his shoulder again. The wood felt warm against his skin, like a living thing. He had played this violin 1,000 times, 10,000 times, but it had never felt quite like this. It was as if the instrument knew what was at stake, as if it was ready to fight alongside him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The room fell away. The judges fell away. Even Vogel fell away. There was nothing left but the music waiting inside him, pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. He thought about what to play. He had prepared pieces for this audition, complex compositions designed to show off technical skill and proper training. But, standing here now, those pieces felt wrong. They felt like lies, like putting on a costume and pretending to be someone he was not. He did not want to pretend anymore. He wanted to tell the truth, and so he chose a different piece. A piece he had never planned to play here. A piece that was too emotional, too raw, too personal for a formal audition. Barber's Adagio for strings. It was the first piece his grandfather had ever taught him. They had sat together in that dusty workshop, the old man's hands shaking with age as he guided Cale's small fingers across the strings. His grandfather had told him that this piece was special, that it contained all the sadness and beauty of life in just a few minutes of music, that if you played it right, if you really meant it, you could make even the coldest heart feel something. Kael had played this piece at his grandfather's funeral. He had played it alone in the back of the laundromat on nights when hope felt impossible. He had played it on street corners for strangers who stopped to listen and walked away with tears in their eyes. It was not a piece that would impress anyone with technical perfection, but it was the truest thing Kael knew how to play. He opened his eyes. He looked directly at Vogel. And then, he drew his bow across the strings. The first note rang out into the silence, pure and clear, and aching with something that words could never capture. It hung in the air like a question, like a prayer, like a challenge, and Kael kept playing. He did not think about technique. He did not think about the judges, or the clock, or the 3 minutes that were already counting down. He thought about his grandfather's smile. He thought about his mother's tired hands. He thought about every person who had ever told him no, and every moment when he had refused to stop believing. The music poured out of him like blood from a wound. Not perfect, not polished, but real. More real than anything he had ever played in his life. And in the front row, behind the long table, Maestro Heinrich Vogel sat perfectly still. His cold blue eyes were fixed on Kael. His hands were clasped tightly together. And on his face, for the first time in 40 years, there was an expression that nobody in that room had ever seen before. He was listening, truly listening, and something in him was beginning to crack. The music filled the room like water filling a glass. It started soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thick and heavy. Each note seemed to breathe on its own, rising and falling like the chest of someone lost in a deep and troubled sleep. Kael played with his eyes closed. He was not in Vienna anymore. He was not standing on a stage in front of judges who held his future in their hands. He was somewhere else, entirely. Somewhere deep inside himself, in a place where the music lived and waited to be set free. He was 8 years old again, sitting in his grandfather's workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and old wood. The old man's hands were wrapped around his own, guiding him through the first notes he had ever played. His grandfather's voice was soft in his ear, patient and kind, telling him that music was not about being perfect. It was about being honest. It was about taking everything you felt inside and giving it a voice. The melody rose higher, and Kael felt something breaking open in his chest. All the years of struggle came flooding back. The nights when he practiced, until his fingers bled. The mornings when he woke up before dawn to work shifts at jobs he hated, just so he could afford to keep chasing this impossible dream. The looks of pity from people who thought he was wasting his life. The loneliness of believing in something that nobody else could see. He poured all of it into the music. Every rejection, every doubt, every moment when he had wanted to give up, but somehow found the strength to keep going. The violin sang with a voice that was not just his own. It was his grandfather's voice. It was his mother's voice. It was the voice of everyone who had ever been told they were not good enough, not smart enough, not talented enough to deserve their dreams. In the audience, something strange was happening. The woman with gray hair had stopped taking notes. Her pen hung forgotten in her hand, and her eyes were glistening with tears she did not bother to hide. The judge beside her, a stern man who had looked bored since the auditions began, was leaning forward in his chair, with his mouth slightly open, as if he had forgotten how to close it. Even the staff member at the back of the room had stopped moving. She stood frozen by the door, her clipboard pressed against her chest, watching Kael with an expression of quiet wonder. But it was Vogel who had changed the most. The maestro sat perfectly still, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white. His face, which had been cold and dismissive just minutes ago, was now unreadable. Something was happening behind those pale blue eyes, something that he was fighting very hard to control. Kael did not see any of this. He was lost in the music, lost in the story it was telling. The adagio built slowly, layer upon layer of sound, weaving together into something larger than the sum of its parts. It was not technically perfect. There were moments when his fingers slipped, when the notes did not come out exactly as they should. But somehow, those imperfections made the music more beautiful, not less. They made it human. The melody reached its peak, and Kale felt tears streaming down his own face. He did not try to stop them. He let them fall, let them become part of the performance, part of the truth he was trying to tell. He thought about the day his grandfather died. He had been 15 years old enough to understand what death meant, but too young to know how to carry the weight of it. He had played this same piece at the funeral, standing alone in front of a small crowd of mourners, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the bow. But he had played anyway, because it was the only way he knew to say goodbye. The music softened now, falling back down from its heights like a bird returning to earth. The notes became gentle, almost fragile, like the last light of day fading into darkness. Kale could feel the end approaching, could feel the final moments of the piece drawing near. He opened his eyes, and what he saw made him almost lose his place in the music. Vogel was crying, not sobbing, not making any sound at all. But tears were rolling down his weathered cheeks, leaving wet tracks on skin that probably had not felt tears in decades. The maestro's face was no longer cold or cruel. It was broken open, exposed, vulnerable in a way that seemed almost painful to witness. The other judges were staring at Vogel with expressions of shock. In 40 years, none of them had ever seen him show emotion. He was a man made of stone, a man who prided himself on being untouchable. For matter, that, and now here he was, weeping silently in front of everyone, undone by a self-taught violinist from Detroit. KL kept playing. He did not know what else to do. The music was almost over now, the final notes approaching like the last breaths of someone at the end of a long journey. He let each one ring out into the silence, giving them space to breathe, to live, to say what words could never say. And then, with one last gentle stroke of the bow, it was over. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever. It faded slowly, reluctantly, as if it did not want to leave. And then, there was silence. Complete and absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels sacred, that feels like it should not be broken by anything as ordinary as speech. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, though nobody knew what. Kale lowered his violin. His arms were trembling. His face was wet with tears he did not remember crying. He felt emptied out, hollow, like he had given everything he had, and there was nothing left inside him. He looked at the judges. The woman with gray hair was openly weeping now, making no effort to hide it. The stern man beside her was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, pretending he was not doing what he was obviously doing. The other judges sat in stunned silence, their notes forgotten, their pens lying untouched on the table. And Vogel. Vogel was still crying. The maestro had not moved since the music began. He sat in the same position, his hands still clasped together, his eyes fixed on Kale. But everything about him was different now. The coldness was gone. The cruelty was gone. What remained was something raw and wounded, something that had been buried for so long, it had almost been forgotten. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, with emotion that none of them knew how to express. Then Vogel moved. He reached up with one trembling hand and wiped the tears from his face. He took a deep breath, then another, trying to compose himself. But his voice, when it finally came, was not the voice of the man who had dismissed Kale without a hearing. It was the voice of someone who had just remembered something important, something he had lost a long time ago. "That violin," Vogel said quietly. "Where did you get it?" Kale blinked, surprised by the question. Of all the things he had expected Vogel to say, this was not one of them. "It was my grandfather's," he said. "He brought it with him when he came to America after the war." Vogel closed his eyes. A fresh tear slipped down his cheek. "I know," he whispered. "I know that violin. I have not heard it in 60 years, but I would recognize its voice anywhere." Kale stared at him, not understanding, and Vogel opened his eyes, and for the first time, there was no coldness in them at all. "Your grandfather," he said. The words hit Kale like a wave he never saw coming. He stood there on the stage, his grandfather's violin still in his hands, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. His mind was spinning, reaching back through memories and stories, searching for something that would explain how this was possible. Vogel rose slowly from his chair. He moved like a man in a dream, stepping around the judges' table and walking toward the stage. The other judges watched in silence, too stunned to speak. None of them had ever seen the maestro leave his seat during an audition. None of them had ever seen him look so human. He stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at Kale with eyes that held 60 years of memories. "I was 12 years old," Vogel said, his voice soft and distant. "It was after the war. Everything was destroyed. My family had lost everything. We were living in a refugee camp, hundreds of us packed together with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the hope that tomorrow might be better than today." He paused, and Kale could see him traveling back through time, back to a world that existed only in memory now. "There was a man in the camp," Vogel continued. "A quiet man, with sad eyes and gentle hands. He had nothing, just like the rest of us. Nothing except an old violin that he carried with him everywhere he went. At night, when the children could not sleep because they were hungry or scared or both, he would play for us. He would sit in the middle of the camp and play music that made us forget where we were. Music that made us believe that beauty still existed in a world that had shown us only ugliness." Kale felt his throat tightening. He knew this story. He had heard pieces of it from his grandfather, fragments shared on quiet evenings when the old man was feeling nostalgic. But he had never known all of it. He had never known about the boy who listened. "I was angry back then," Vogel said. "Angry at the world for taking everything from me. Angry at God for letting it happen. Angry at myself for surviving when so many others did not. I trusted no one. I believed in nothing. And then this man, this stranger, saw something in me that I could not see in myself." He looked at the violin in Kale's hands, and fresh tears formed in his eyes. "He taught me to play," Vogel whispered. "He gave me lessons every day for 2 years, asking nothing in return. He told me that music was stronger than hate, that it could heal wounds that nothing else could reach, that as long as I could play, I would never truly be alone." Vogel's voice broke on the last word. He stood there for a moment, unable to continue, struggling with emotions he had buried for most of his life. "When I left the camp," he finally said, "I promised him I would never forget what he taught me. I promised I would use music to bring light into dark places, just as he had done. But somewhere along the way, I forgot. I became successful. I became famous. I became so focused on perfection and standards and reputation that I forgot why I started playing in the first place." He looked up at Kale, and there was shame in his eyes now. Real shame. The kind that comes from realizing you have betrayed something sacred. "I became the very thing your grandfather taught me to fight against," Vogel said. "I became someone who judges people by their appearance, their background, their credentials. I became cold and cruel because I thought that was what greatness required. And tonight, when you walked onto this stage, I looked at you and saw everything I had learned to dismiss. A self-taught musician with no pedigree. An old violin that belonged in a museum. A young man who did not fit the mold I had created." He shook his head slowly, disgusted with himself. "I was wrong," he said. "I was so terribly wrong. Not just about you. About everything. About what music means. And who deserves to make it. Your grandfather would be ashamed of what I have become." Kale did not know what to say. He stood there with tears rolling down his cheeks, holding the violin that had connected two strangers across 60 years and thousands of miles. The violin that had survived wars and loss and silence, only to speak again in a concert hall in Vienna, reminding a bitter old man of the boy he used to be. "I am sorry," Vogel said, and the words seemed to cost him everything. "I am sorry for what I said to you. I am sorry for all the people I have hurt over the years, all the dreams I have crushed because I forgot what dreams are worth. But most of all, I am sorry for betraying the memory of the man who saved my life." He reached out and placed his hand on the edge of the stage, steadying himself as if he might fall. "You do not just have talent," he said, looking into Cale's eyes. "You have something far more rare. You have truth. You have the same gift your grandfather had. The ability to reach inside people and touch the parts of them they keep hidden from the world. That cannot be taught. That cannot be learned. It can only be given, passed down from one soul to another like a flame that refuses to go out." Vogel straightened up. He turned to face the other judges, who were watching in stunned silence. "This audition is over," he announced. "But not for the reason I intended." He looked back at Kale. "I do not just want you in this conservatory," he said. "I want to conduct you myself. I want to stand on stage beside you and hear that violin sing again. I want the world to hear what I heard tonight, what I heard 60 years ago in a refugee camp when I was a broken boy with nothing to believe in." The woman with gray hair was the first to start clapping, then the stern man beside her, then the other judges, one by one, until the whole room was filled with applause. The staff member by the door was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it. And somewhere in the back of the hall, more people had gathered, drawn by the music they had heard through the walls, and they were clapping too, but Cale barely heard any of it. He was thinking about his grandfather, about the old man's hands, guiding his own, about the stories he used to tell, stories about dark times and small lights, and the belief that music could save the world one person at a time. His grandfather had saved Heinrich Vogel. And 60 years later, that same gift had brought Kael to this moment, standing on a stage in Vienna, holding a violin that carried more history than he had ever known. 3 months later, Kael performed at his first professional concert. Vogel conducted, just as he had promised. The audience gave them a standing ovation that lasted almost 10 minutes. Critics called it one of the most moving performances they had ever witnessed. But the moment Kael remembered most came after the concert, when Vogel found him backstage and handed him a small photograph. It showed a young boy and an old man sitting together in what looked like a makeshift shelter. The boy was holding a violin. The old man was smiling. "He gave me everything," Vogel said quietly. Today, Kael performs on the world's greatest stages. He has played at Carnegie Hall, the Sydney Opera House, and concert halls across Europe and Asia. But every summer, he returns to Detroit. He teaches free music lessons in community centers and laundromats, in church basements and school gymnasiums. He finds children who have been told they are not good enough, and he shows them what his grandfather showed him. That music does not care where you come from. That talent is not something you are born with, but something you grow through love and patience and stubborn refusal to give up. That the most beautiful sounds often come from the most unlikely places. And every time he plays, he carries two people with him. His grandfather, who started the flame, and the bitter old Maestro who remembered, just in time, what that flame was for. Some gifts are not meant to be kept. They are meant to be passed on, hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. That is the real music. And it never stops playing.